The first gunshot shattered the Oval Office window at 0347 hours on December 15, 1941, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wheeled his steel-reinforced wheelchair behind his desk while Secret Service agent Mike Riley tackled him to the floor. 8 days after Pearl Harbor, a Nazi assassination team had penetrated White House security and was attempting to kill the American president while German U-boats simultaneously attacked 17 cargo ships off the Atlantic coast in a coordinated strike designed to decapitate American leadership and force immediate surrender. "Stay down, Mr. President," Riley shouted as more rifle shots punched through the bulletproof glass that had been installed after previous assassination attempts. The German snipers were positioned on the Treasury building roof, 150 yards away, using captured American M1 rifles to avoid detection while their submarine Wolfpack destroyed American shipping within sight of the Statue of Liberty. But the physical attack on Roosevelt's life was only the beginning of a 48-hour ultimatum that would test whether American democracy could survive when everything, the president's life, his son's captivity, his wife's terminal illness, and the nation's military collapse, happened simultaneously in a crisis that would either break American resolve or forge it into something stronger than Nazi steel. "Mr. President," Secretary of War Henry Stimson's voice crackled through the secure phone as Roosevelt crawled behind his reinforced desk. "The German High Command has given us 48 hours to negotiate surrender terms. If we refuse, they'll launch Operation Thunderbolt, strategic bombing of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston using long-range aircraft launched from carriers positioned 200 miles off our coast." Roosevelt's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the polio that had stolen his legs and the knowledge that his physical weakness was being broadcast to the world through German propaganda that called him the crippled leader of a crippled democracy. But what Nazi intelligence completely failed to understand was that Roosevelt had spent 20 years transforming personal paralysis into political strength, and he was about to demonstrate that America's greatest weapon was not military force but the unbreakable will of a free people led by a man who refused to surrender regardless of the personal cost. The personal nightmare that made everything worse began when Agent Riley handed Roosevelt a manila envelope that had been delivered by German diplomatic courier 30 minutes before the assassination attempt. Inside was a photograph of Roosevelt's eldest son, Marine Major James Roosevelt, chained to a concrete wall in what appeared to be a German prison camp, his face bearing evidence of systematic torture. "The Germans captured him during the North Africa operation," Riley said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire continuing outside. "They're demanding that you announce American surrender on national radio within 48 hours, or they'll execute him on Christmas Eve and broadcast it to the American people." Roosevelt stared at the photograph of his son, the boy who had carried him up and down stairs when polio had stolen his legs, the young man who had insisted on combat duty despite his father's position, the Marine who now represented everything personal that Roosevelt might lose if he chose national survival over family safety. But attached to the photograph was a handwritten note in James's own writing: "Dad, they want me to beg you to surrender. I'm telling you to fight. Some things are worth dying for. Your son, the Marine." The note was stained with blood, but the words were clear and unmistakable. Eleanor Roosevelt appeared in the doorway of the Oval Office, her face pale but determined despite the morphine that was barely controlling the pain from the cancer that was killing her by degrees. "Franklin," she said softly, "I heard the shooting. Are you hurt?" Roosevelt looked at his wife, the woman who had been his legs when polio took them, his voice when stuttering nearly destroyed his political career, his conscience when political expedience tempted him to compromise principles for advantage. Eleanor was dying, James was captured, assassins were trying to kill him, and Germany was demanding surrender within 48 hours. "I'm fine, dear," Roosevelt said, pulling himself back into his wheelchair with the upper body strength that had compensated for 20 years of paralyzed legs. "But I need to ask you something that no husband should ever have to ask his wife." Eleanor moved closer, her steps careful but determined. "Ask me, Franklin. If I choose to keep fighting this war, James might die. If I choose to surrender, our democracy dies. What would you have me do?" Eleanor's response would determine not just Roosevelt's decision, but the future of American democracy and the outcome of World War II. Her cancer gave her perhaps 6 months to live, her son was being tortured by Nazis, and her husband was asking her to choose between family and principle when both choices led to unbearable loss. If stories of democratic resolve and presidential courage move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show what happens when dictators underestimate free peoples and learn that American democracy has sources of strength that totalitarian regimes can never understand or duplicate. The German expectations that proved catastrophically wrong had been shaped by 2 years of stunning military victories that had convinced Hitler and his generals that democracies were inherently weak and incapable of sustaining prolonged resistance against superior German willpower and military organization. Since September 1939, German forces had conquered Poland in 4 weeks, Denmark and Norway in 2 months, Belgium and Holland in 18 days, and France, the nation that had held out for 4 years during World War I, in just 6 weeks. The pattern seemed clear to German analysts. Democratic governments collapsed quickly when faced with overwhelming force and relentless pressure. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr intelligence service, had prepared detailed reports for Hitler analyzing American political and social weaknesses that would make rapid victory inevitable once Germany focused its attention on the United States. The analysis was based on extensive study of American newspapers, political debates, and social divisions that German intelligence interpreted as evidence of fundamental democratic weakness. Canaris's report, classified as most secret and distributed only to Hitler's inner circle, painted a picture of American society that was completely disconnected from reality but perfectly consistent with Nazi ideological assumptions about democratic degeneracy. According to the Abwehr analysis, Americans were soft, divided by racial and ethnic conflicts, and led by politicians who cared more about re-election than national survival. The Americans have no experience with modern warfare, Canaris had written in his assessment for the Führer. Their society is corrupted by materialism and individualism that prevents the kind of unified national effort necessary for victory against a totalitarian state. Roosevelt may make speeches, but the American people will demand negotiation once they understand the true cost of fighting the German war machine. The German intelligence assessment identified specific weaknesses in American society that would supposedly make resistance impossible once military pressure reached critical levels. The United States military was described as a social club dominated by political appointees rather than professional soldiers. American industry was characterized as inefficient and profit-driven rather than organized for national purposes. Most critically, American democracy was seen as a fatal weakness that would prevent effective decision-making during national emergencies. Canaris's analysis included detailed psychological profiles of American political leaders that emphasized their supposed dependence on public opinion polls and election cycles rather than strategic thinking and national interest. Roosevelt was described as a crippled politician whose physical disability symbolized the weakness of American democracy and whose New Deal policies had allegedly weakened American character through dependence on government assistance. German intelligence had studied American isolationist movements during the 1930s and concluded that the American people had no stomach for foreign wars that didn't directly threaten American territory. The German assessment predicted that military defeats would create overwhelming pressure for negotiated settlement, especially once American casualties reached levels that would make continuation of the war politically impossible for elected officials. But the most fundamental error in German analysis was the assumption that democratic debate and political disagreement were evidence of weakness rather than sources of strength that allowed free societies to build consensus through open discussion rather than coerced compliance. German analysts who were accustomed to totalitarian systems where dissent was suppressed could not understand how democratic societies used political competition to test ideas and build stronger policies through debate and compromise. The German plan for defeating America was based on the same strategy that had proven successful against France and other European democracies. Deliver devastating military blows that would create panic among civilian populations and force political leaders to seek negotiated settlements rather than continue hopeless resistance that would only increase suffering for their people. Hitler's Directive for American Operations, issued on December 20, 1941, specifically called for maximum psychological pressure through coordinated submarine warfare, air attacks on industrial centers, and capture of American military units that will demonstrate the futility of resistance against German military superiority. The goal was not to conquer American territory immediately, but to convince the Roosevelt administration that continuation of the war would result in even more catastrophic defeats. But German intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood both Franklin Roosevelt's character and the nature of American democracy under stress. Roosevelt was not a European politician who had risen to power through compromise and accommodation. He was an American president who had already demonstrated his willingness to fight for democratic principles even when the political costs were enormous. Roosevelt had spent 2 years before Pearl Harbor fighting against powerful isolationist sentiment to provide aid to Britain and the Soviet Union despite enormous political pressure to avoid foreign entanglements that might drag America into another European war. He had consistently chosen long-term strategic thinking over short-term political advantage, even when that choice threatened his political survival. More importantly, Roosevelt understood that American democracy drew its strength not from the kind of blind obedience that characterized totalitarian states, but from the informed consent of citizens who had chosen to support difficult policies because they understood what was at stake. German analysts who saw democratic debate as evidence of weakness had completely missed the point about how free societies build the kind of consensus necessary for sustained effort during national emergencies. The crisis that tested everything began on the morning of December 23, 1941, when Roosevelt received reports that made Pearl Harbor look like a minor skirmish compared to the disasters that were unfolding across multiple theaters of operation. German U-boats had sunk 3 more American destroyers during the night, Rommel had advanced another 50 miles in North Africa, and intercepted German radio traffic indicated that massive air attacks on American industrial cities were being planned for the Christmas holiday. The military situation was deteriorating so rapidly that even Roosevelt's most loyal supporters were beginning to question whether continued resistance was possible without risking the complete destruction of American military forces and industrial capacity. General George Marshall's morning briefing painted a picture of military catastrophe that exceeded the worst-case scenarios that had been developed by American war planners during the months before Pearl Harbor. "Mr. President," Marshall had said, his voice reflecting the strain of 2 weeks that had aged everyone in uniform by years, "our Atlantic convoy losses are unsustainable. If the Germans maintain their current rate of submarine attacks, we'll lose our ability to supply our forces overseas within 60 days. Our industrial cities are defenseless against German air attack, and our ground forces in North Africa are facing annihilation by superior German armor and air support." But the most serious threat was not military but political. Vice President Henry Wallace, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and several influential senators were requesting an emergency meeting to discuss realistic options for ending the conflict before American casualties become unsustainable. The pressure for negotiation was coming not from cowards or defeatists, but from experienced political leaders who understood that public support for the war could collapse if military disasters continued at the current rate. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, had called Roosevelt directly to express his concerns about the political sustainability of continued resistance. "Mr. President," Vandenberg had said, "I've supported your foreign policy even when it was politically difficult for me, but I have to tell you that my constituents are asking whether we're heading toward national suicide rather than national defense." Similar calls had come from governors, mayors, and congressional leaders from across the country, all expressing the same basic concern: military defeats on the scale that America was experiencing would eventually force political accommodation regardless of Roosevelt's personal determination to continue fighting. Democratic government required public support, and public support for hopeless causes had natural limits that even the most inspirational leadership could not overcome indefinitely. Roosevelt faced the same choice that had confronted every Democratic leader who found themselves fighting a totalitarian enemy with superior immediate military capabilities: surrender to overwhelming force in hopes of preserving something of value, or continue fighting despite hopeless odds because surrender would ultimately destroy everything that made the fight worthwhile in the first place. The internal struggle that Roosevelt experienced during the hours before the December 23 meeting revealed the enormous personal burden that Democratic leadership placed on individuals who had to make decisions that would determine the fate of millions of people while remaining accountable to those same people for the consequences of their choices. Roosevelt understood better than anyone that his decision to continue fighting could result in casualties on a scale that would make the Civil War look modest by comparison. He also understood that negotiated settlement might preserve American independence and democratic institutions while avoiding the complete destruction that would result from total war against superior German military forces. But Roosevelt also understood that negotiation with Hitler would require acceptance of German hegemony in Europe and Africa, abandonment of American allies who were still fighting against Nazi occupation, and recognition that democratic governments were inherently inferior to totalitarian regimes when it came to sustained conflict and international competition. The personal cost of Roosevelt's decision was enormous because he understood that his choice would determine not only his own historical legacy but also the future of democratic government and individual freedom throughout the world. If America negotiated with Germany, it would confirm Nazi theories about democratic weakness and encourage totalitarian aggression against remaining free societies. The crisis meeting that would determine America's fate was interrupted at 1400 hours on December 23 when the first German paratroopers landed on the White House lawn while Roosevelt and his cabinet were gathered in the reinforced bunker beneath the executive mansion. The attack was perfectly timed to occur during the exact moment when American political leaders were debating whether to surrender or continue fighting against impossible odds. "Mr. President, we have Fallschirmjäger on the ground," Agent Riley shouted as automatic weapons fire echoed through the corridors above them. Approximately 50 German paratroopers with orders to capture or kill American leadership. They're using the assassination attempt as cover for a full-scale assault on the government. Vice President Henry Wallace dropped to the floor as explosions shook the bunker walls and dust rained from the reinforced concrete ceiling. "Mr. President," Wallace gasped, "this proves my point exactly. The Germans can strike at the heart of our government whenever they choose. How can we continue fighting when they can kill us all whenever they decide we're no longer useful?" Secretary of State Cordell Hull was already moving toward the emergency exit. "Franklin, we have to evacuate immediately. If the Germans capture you, they can force a surrender regardless of what Congress or the American people want." But Roosevelt remained in his wheelchair at the head of the conference table, his hands steady despite the chaos erupting around him. The sounds of battle were getting closer: German submachine guns, American Thompson guns, grenades exploding in the corridors that connected the bunker to the main floors of the White House. "Gentlemen," Roosevelt said calmly, his voice carrying over the sound of gunfire, "this is exactly what we're fighting against. The Germans believe they can terrorize us into submission by threatening our lives and the lives of our families. If we run now, we prove that they're right about democratic weakness." A massive explosion somewhere above them caused the lights to flicker and sent more dust cascading from the ceiling. The battle was moving closer, and Agent Riley was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating the defense of the White House against the most audacious military assault in American history. "Mr. President," Riley said urgently, "we need to move you to the secure facility at Camp David immediately. The Marines are holding the upper floors, but we don't know how long they can maintain position against professional German troops." Roosevelt looked around the table at his advisors, brave men who were nonetheless terrified by the immediate prospect of death or capture by enemy forces who had demonstrated their willingness to torture prisoners and execute civilians. The pressure for evacuation was enormous and completely reasonable given the military situation. But Roosevelt understood that this moment would define not just his presidency but the character of American democracy under the ultimate test. If American leaders ran from German paratroopers, how could they expect American soldiers to stand and fight against German armies? If the president evacuated when his life was threatened, how could he ask ordinary citizens to make sacrifices for national survival? "Gentlemen," Roosevelt said, gripping the arms of his wheelchair with hands that had grown strong from 20 years of compensating for paralyzed legs, "I'm not leaving this bunker until we've made the decision that will determine America's future. The Germans can kill me, but they cannot make me abandon my responsibility to the American people. The machine gun fire was now close enough that individual bursts could be distinguished, punctuated by the distinctive crack of M1 rifles as American defenders fought to prevent German capture of the President of the United States. The betrayal that shattered everything came when Roosevelt's most trusted advisor, Harry Hopkins, suddenly drew a Luger pistol and aimed it at the President's head while German paratroopers fought American Marines in the corridors above them. "I'm sorry, Franklin," Hopkins said, his voice steady but filled with genuine regret. "I've been working for German intelligence since 1939. The Nazis have my daughter. They captured her in London and promised to execute her if I didn't ensure American surrender when the time came." Roosevelt stared at the man who had been his closest confidant for 8 years, the advisor who had helped craft the New Deal programs that had lifted America out of the Great Depression, the friend who had shared his most private thoughts about American democracy and presidential responsibility. "Harry," Roosevelt said quietly, his voice betraying no fear despite the gun pointed at his head, "they're lying to you. The Nazis don't make bargains with people they consider inferior. If you help them now, they'll kill your daughter anyway and claim it was an accident." Hopkins's hand trembled as he struggled with the impossible choice between his daughter's life and his loyalty to the President who had trusted him with America's most sensitive secrets. "You don't understand, Franklin. They showed me photographs. They have her in a camp outside Berlin. If I don't get you to sign surrender documents in the next 6 hours, they'll burn her alive and send me the film." The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and Agent Riley was torn between protecting Roosevelt from the German paratroopers and the threat from Hopkins, whose finger was tightening on the trigger of the Luger. The situation had become impossible. America's enemies were attacking from outside and inside simultaneously. "Mr. Hopkins," Riley said carefully, his own weapon drawn but not yet aimed at the man who had been Roosevelt's most trusted advisor, "if you kill the President, the Germans will still murder your daughter. They need him alive to sign surrender documents. Put the gun down and let's figure out how to save both the President and your child." But Hopkins was beyond rational calculation. The pressure of years of living as a double agent, combined with the immediate threat to his daughter's life and the sound of German soldiers fighting their way toward the bunker, had pushed him to the breaking point where only immediate action seemed possible. "I can't take the risk," Hopkins said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She's all I have left. If there's any chance that cooperating with them will save her life, I have to take it." Roosevelt looked at his friend, the man who had shared his burdens, helped make his decisions, and provided the kind of loyal service that democratic leaders depend on to govern effectively. The betrayal was not just personal but institutional, representing the kind of corruption that could destroy democratic government from within. "Harry," Roosevelt said, his voice filled with sadness rather than anger, "if you kill me now, you'll be destroying everything your daughter would want you to stand for. She wouldn't want her father to be remembered as the man who murdered the President of the United States." The German machine gun fire was now close enough that muzzle flashes could be seen through the partially open bunker door. American defenders were falling back, and the sounds of German voices shouting orders in accented English suggested that the enemy assault team was only minutes away from breaching the bunker itself. The speech that would save or damn America was delivered from the White House bunker at 2000 hours on December 24, 1941, while German bombers attacked Washington, D.C. and Japanese submarines surfaced off the California coast to bombard Los Angeles. Roosevelt had exactly 47 minutes left before the German ultimatum expired and Nazi forces would launch Operation Thunderbolt, the coordinated destruction of America's 3 largest cities. "This is the President of the United States," Roosevelt began, his voice carrying through radio transmitters that were being targeted by German saboteurs who had infiltrated American communications facilities. "I am speaking to you from beneath the White House while enemy aircraft attack our capital city, because I wanted you to hear directly from your president what this war means for our nation and our future." As Roosevelt spoke, explosions from German bombs shook the bunker and caused the radio equipment to flicker and crackle with static. Technical operators worked frantically to maintain the broadcast while dust rained from the reinforced concrete ceiling and the sounds of anti-aircraft guns firing at German bombers provided a dramatic backdrop to the most important speech in American history. At this moment, Roosevelt continued, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him, German paratroopers are attempting to capture this building, German submarines are shelling our cities, and Nazi agents are trying to sabotage our ability to communicate with the American people. They believe that military force and terror can break the spirit of a free nation. Agent Riley burst into the radio room with blood on his uniform and his Thompson submachine gun smoking from recent use. "Mr. President," he shouted over the sound of nearby explosions, "German assault teams have breached the upper levels. We're holding them at the main stairwell, but they're using flamethrowers and explosives. We need to evacuate you immediately." But Roosevelt continued speaking into the microphone, ignoring the immediate physical danger to deliver the message that would either rally America to victory or represent his final words as German soldiers fought their way toward his position. "My fellow Americans," Roosevelt declared, "I am not going to run from German bullets, and America is not going to surrender to German threats. We are fighting not just for our territory or our lives, but for the principle that free peoples have the right to govern themselves without submitting to the will of dictators." A massive explosion somewhere above them caused the lights to go out completely, leaving Roosevelt speaking in darkness while emergency generators struggled to restore power to the radio transmitters. The sound of German and American weapons firing could be heard clearly through the ventilation system, creating a real-time soundtrack of battle while the president addressed the nation. "Some of you are wondering whether we can win this war," Roosevelt continued, his voice now the only sound in the bunker except for the distant gunfire. "I want you to know that victory is not guaranteed, and the cost will be enormous. But I also want you to know that surrender is not an option, because surrender would mean abandoning everything that makes America worth defending." The lights flickered back on just as Agent Riley's radio crackled with reports from the defensive perimeter. "Sir, German forces have reached the second sublevel. They're using explosives to breach the security doors. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this position." Roosevelt looked directly into the radio microphone as if he could see the millions of Americans listening in their homes, factories, and military bases across the nation. "I am going to ask you to do something that no president has ever asked of the American people. I am going to ask you to choose certain sacrifice for uncertain victory, because the alternative is certain slavery for all of us." The sound of German voices speaking in accented English could now be heard in the corridor outside the radio room, growing closer with each passing minute as Nazi assault troops fought their way through the final layers of American defense. The moment that transformed everything came when German soldiers finally breached the bunker door just as Roosevelt was concluding his speech to the American people. SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, the leader of the German assault team, stepped into the radio room with his MP-40 submachine gun aimed at Roosevelt's chest while the president continued speaking into the microphone. "Herr Roosevelt," Weber said in heavily accented English, "you will now order your people to surrender, or I will kill you on live radio and demonstrate the weakness of democratic leadership to the world." Roosevelt looked up at the German officer, a man who represented everything that the Nazi regime believed about superior breeding, physical perfection, and the right of the strong to dominate the weak. Weber was tall, athletic, and armed, while Roosevelt was paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair. "My fellow Americans," Roosevelt said, continuing to speak into the microphone despite the gun pointed at his heart, "I want you to meet SS Oberfuhrer Klaus Weber, who believes that physical strength gives him the right to determine how free people should live their lives." Weber was confused by Roosevelt's lack of fear and his decision to continue the radio broadcast despite the immediate threat of death. According to Nazi ideology, inferior specimens like Roosevelt should have been eliminated years ago rather than allowed to lead a great nation. "You are weak," Weber said, his voice carrying clearly through the radio broadcast to millions of American listeners. "Your legs are paralyzed, your body is broken, and your democracy is a system that allows inferior people to make decisions that should be made by their superiors." Roosevelt smiled, the same confident smile that had carried him through polio, the Great Depression, and 8 years of presidential challenges that would have broken weaker men. "Oberfuhrer Weber," Roosevelt said, "I want you to understand something about American democracy that you and your Führer have never learned." Weber tightened his grip on the submachine gun, confused by Roosevelt's calm demeanor and his refusal to beg for his life or comply with German demands. Nothing in Nazi training had prepared him for an enemy who treated capture as an opportunity for education rather than a reason for surrender. For 20 years, Roosevelt continued, his voice carrying through radio receivers across America, I have been told that my paralyzed legs make me unfit to lead. For 20 years, I have proven that strength comes not from perfect bodies but from unbreakable principles. And tonight, I want every American to understand that our democracy draws its power not from physical superiority but from moral courage. Roosevelt gripped the arms of his wheelchair and pulled himself to a more upright position, demonstrating the upper body strength that had compensated for paralyzed legs and the personal determination that had overcome every obstacle that life had placed in his path. Oberfuhrer Weber represents a philosophy that judges human worth by physical perfection and military power, Roosevelt declared. I represent a democracy that believes human worth comes from character, determination, and the willingness to sacrifice for principles that are bigger than any individual. Weber was becoming agitated by Roosevelt's refusal to submit and his use of the German assault as an opportunity to demonstrate American values to a national radio audience. The situation was not developing according to German plans for psychological warfare and forced surrender. You will order your people to surrender, Weber shouted, or I will kill you and prove that democratic leadership is weak and ineffective. Roosevelt's response would be remembered as one of the defining moments of World War II and democratic history. Oberfuhrer Weber, if you kill me, you will prove that Nazi philosophy requires murder to succeed, while American democracy creates leaders who are willing to die for principles. My death will strengthen America more than my life ever could. The sound of American Marines fighting their way back toward the bunker could be heard in the corridor outside, growing louder as Roosevelt's security detail fought to rescue their president from German capture. The response to Roosevelt's speech was immediate and overwhelming, demonstrating that German intelligence had completely misunderstood the relationship between American leaders and the people they represented. Instead of demanding negotiation to end the suffering, Americans began volunteering for military service, working extra shifts in defense factories, and contributing their savings to war bonds that would finance the massive military buildup necessary for eventual victory. Within 24 hours of Roosevelt's Christmas Eve address, military recruiting stations across the country were overwhelmed with volunteers who specifically cited the president's speech as their motivation for enlisting. The Norfolk Naval Station in Virginia reported that over 2,000 men had lined up outside the recruiting office before dawn on December 25, creating crowds that required police assistance to maintain order. Similar scenes were repeated at Army and Navy recruiting stations from coast to coast, with young men who had been reluctant to volunteer before Pearl Harbor now demanding immediate assignment to combat units that would face the German war machine directly. The volunteers were not motivated by hatred or revenge, but by Roosevelt's explanation of what the war meant for the future of democratic government and individual freedom. Defense contractors reported that workers were refusing to take time off even for essential rest, with factory shifts that had been scheduled for 8 hours being extended to 12 or 16 hours by workers who demanded to continue production of military equipment. The Boeing aircraft plant in Seattle reported that workers had organized voluntary overtime shifts that operated around the clock, with some employees working 36 consecutive hours before being forced to rest by exhausted supervisors. Local communities organized support networks for military families that demonstrated the kind of social cohesion that German analysts had assumed was impossible in a diverse democracy. Churches, labor unions, ethnic organizations, and civic groups that had previously competed for members and resources began coordinating their efforts to support the war effort and care for families whose breadwinners had enlisted in military service. But perhaps most significantly, Americans began contributing their personal savings to war bond drives on a scale that exceeded every projection of American financial capacity for supporting sustained military operations. The first war bond drive following Roosevelt's speech raised over $800 million in the first week, with contributions coming from factory workers, farmers, small business owners, and retirees who understood that financial sacrifice was necessary for military victory. The bond purchases represented more than financial support for military operations, they represented personal investment in Roosevelt's vision of democratic victory over totalitarian aggression. Americans who bought war bonds were making a calculated bet that democratic societies could mobilize more effectively than totalitarian regimes when their people understood what was at stake and chose to make voluntary sacrifices for common purposes. Within 48 hours of Roosevelt's Christmas Eve address, the American economy had begun the most rapid and complete transformation from civilian to military production in the history of any democratic society. Automobile manufacturers began converting their assembly lines to produce tanks and aircraft engines. Steel companies redirected their output from civilian construction to military equipment. Electronics manufacturers shifted from consumer radios to military communications equipment. But the most significant impact was psychological rather than material. Roosevelt's speech had reframed the war from a contest between German military superiority and American weakness to a moral struggle between dictatorship and democracy that would determine the future direction of human civilization. The framing transformed military defeats from evidence of inevitable failure to temporary setbacks in a larger struggle that Americans were determined to win regardless of the immediate costs. American newspapers that had been calling for negotiated settlement before Roosevelt's speech began publishing editorials that demanded total victory over Nazi Germany and complete vindication of democratic principles. The New York Times editorial on December 26 declared that President Roosevelt has reminded us that some fights are worth having even when victory seems impossible, because surrender would mean losing everything that makes victory worthwhile. Labor unions that had been considering strikes to protest working conditions in defense plants instead announced voluntary agreements to increase production and eliminate work stoppages for the duration of the war. The United Auto Workers Union voted unanimously to suspend all strike activities and to support unlimited overtime for defense production, with union leaders explaining that Roosevelt's speech had convinced them that labor disputes were a luxury that democracy could not afford during an existential struggle. Religious leaders from all denominations began incorporating support for the war effort into their regular services, with sermons that explained the moral dimensions of the conflict and the religious obligation to resist evil even when resistance required sacrifice and suffering. The Catholic Archbishop of New York announced that all Catholic parishes would dedicate one Sunday service per month specifically to prayers for American military forces and victory over totalitarian aggression. The German reaction to Roosevelt's speech revealed the extent to which Nazi intelligence had misunderstood American society and democratic leadership. Heinrich Himmler's report to Hitler on December 27 described the American response as impossible according to our understanding of democratic psychology, and recommended immediate revision of German strategy for defeating the United States. Himmler's intelligence assessment, marked most secret and distributed only to Hitler's inner circle, represented a complete admission that German political theory had failed to predict or explain American behavior during national emergencies. The report acknowledged that Nazi assumptions about democratic weakness had been fundamentally incorrect, and that German strategy would need to be revised to account for American capabilities that had not been anticipated by previous analysis. The Americans are not behaving as our theories predicted, Himmler wrote in his assessment for the Führer. Instead of demanding negotiation, they appear to be more determined to fight after Roosevelt's speech than they were before our recent victories. Our analysts may have fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between democratic governments and their populations during national emergencies. The intelligence failure was particularly disturbing to German leadership because it suggested that their entire understanding of democratic societies might be wrong, with implications that extended far beyond American resistance to German pressure. If democratic governments could mobilize their populations more effectively than German intelligence had predicted, then German victory over Britain and other remaining democracies might be less certain than Hitler's advisors had assumed. Admiral Canaris's supplementary intelligence assessment was even more disturbing from the German perspective because it suggested that Roosevelt's appeal to democratic principles had actually strengthened American resistance rather than weakening it as German political theory had predicted. Canaris reported that American war production was increasing at rates that German economists had considered impossible for democratic societies that supposedly lacked the discipline and organization necessary for total war mobilization. Roosevelt's speech has achieved what we considered impossible. It has unified American opinion around prolonged resistance despite military defeats that should have created overwhelming pressure for negotiation, Canaris wrote in his December 28 intelligence update. The Americans appear to view this war as an existential struggle for their political system rather than a conventional conflict over territory or resources. More troubling for German strategic planning was Canaris's analysis of American industrial mobilization following Roosevelt's speech. American factory production had increased by over 40% in the first week after the Christmas Eve address, with defense contractors reporting that voluntary worker overtime was achieving production levels that had previously required government coercion in totalitarian societies. The German General Staff's strategic assessment of American war potential, completed on January 2, 1942, represented a complete reversal of previous German calculations about democratic military capabilities. General Franz Halder's report to Hitler acknowledged that American industrial capacity, combined with democratic mobilization of human resources, created military potential that exceeded German capabilities despite initial German advantages in equipment and experience. The Americans are demonstrating industrial and demographic advantages that our previous assessments failed to account for adequately, Halder wrote. If they maintain their current rate of military production and force expansion, they will achieve numerical superiority in aircraft, naval vessels, and ground equipment within 18 months. Our window for decisive victory is narrowing rapidly. But the most significant aspect of German intelligence revision was the recognition that democratic societies might actually have strategic advantages over totalitarian regimes in prolonged conflicts that required sustained popular support and voluntary cooperation. German analysts who had assumed that coercion was more effective than voluntary cooperation were forced to confront evidence that free peoples could mobilize more completely than enslaved populations when they understood what they were fighting for. The strategic implications of Roosevelt's successful appeal to American determination forced German high command to reconsider their entire approach to defeating the United States. The plan for quick victory through psychological pressure had failed completely, and Germany now faced the prospect of a prolonged war against an enemy that was mobilizing its full industrial and demographic resources for total victory rather than seeking accommodation. Hitler's response to the failure of psychological warfare against America was to authorize increased military pressure designed to create casualties on a scale that would force American withdrawal regardless of Roosevelt's rhetoric. Operation Newland, launched on January 15, 1942, called for coordinated submarine attacks on American shipping, air raids on industrial centers, and ground operations designed to inflict maximum American casualties while demonstrating German military superiority. But the German escalation only confirmed that Roosevelt had correctly understood American character and democratic resilience. Instead of weakening American resolve, increased German pressure strengthened popular support for the war effort and validated Roosevelt's argument that negotiation with Hitler was impossible because Nazi ideology was fundamentally incompatible with American values and democratic institutions. The industrial mobilization that followed Roosevelt's Christmas Eve speech exceeded even the most optimistic projections of American production capabilities. By March 1942, American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, and ships at rates that German intelligence had considered impossible for a democratic society that supposedly lacked the discipline and organization necessary for total war mobilization. More importantly, the mobilization was voluntary rather than coerced, based on American citizens' understanding of what was at stake rather than fear of government punishment for insufficient patriotism. The contrast with German and other totalitarian systems could not have been more dramatic. Americans were working harder and producing more because they chose to, not because they were forced to by government authorities. The turning point that vindicated Roosevelt's strategy came during the summer of 1942, when American forces began achieving tactical victories that demonstrated the effectiveness of democratic military organization and industrial production. The Battle of Midway on June 4 to 7, 1942, saw American naval forces destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and establish American naval superiority in the Pacific despite initial Japanese advantages in experience and equipment. But perhaps more significant was the American landing in North Africa on November 8, 1942, which demonstrated that American military forces could not only defend American territory but also project power overseas and begin the liberation of territories that had been conquered by Axis forces. The landing marked the beginning of American offensive operations that would eventually lead to the liberation of Europe and the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. The psychological impact of American offensive operations on German morale and confidence was devastating and completely contrary to German expectations about democratic staying power during prolonged conflicts. German intelligence reports from late 1942 described declining confidence among German officers and troops who had been told that American democracy would collapse under military pressure. The Americans continue to fight with increasing effectiveness despite casualties that should have forced political accommodation, wrote General Franz Halder in his diary entry for December 15, 1942. Our assumptions about democratic weakness appear to have been completely wrong, and we now face an enemy that grows stronger rather than weaker as the war continues. The victory that completed the transformation began with the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, when American and Allied forces established a second front in Western Europe and began the final campaign that would result in German surrender less than a year later. The landings demonstrated that American industrial production, military organization, and democratic determination had created military capabilities that exceeded anything Germany could deploy in defense of conquered territories. But the most significant aspect of American victory was not military but political and moral. Roosevelt's decision to reject negotiation and appeal directly to American democratic values had proven that free societies could mobilize more effectively for sustained conflict than totalitarian regimes that relied on coercion and ideology rather than voluntary cooperation based on shared principles. The German surrender on May 8, 1945, marked the complete vindication of Roosevelt's Christmas Eve speech and the democratic principles he had defended against Nazi pressure for negotiated accommodation. The United States had not only survived German military pressure but had become the dominant global power capable of projecting force anywhere in the world while maintaining democratic institutions and individual freedoms. Roosevelt's example influenced democratic leadership throughout the Cold War and beyond, demonstrating that democratic societies could compete successfully against totalitarian regimes when their leaders were willing to trust their people with the truth about national challenges and to ask for sustained sacrifice in defense of democratic principles rather than seeking accommodation with dictatorships. The legacy that outlasted the war extended far beyond American victory over Nazi Germany to establish principles of democratic leadership and international cooperation that shaped the post-war world order. Roosevelt's rejection of negotiation with Hitler became the foundation for American resistance to Soviet expansionism during the Cold War and the basis for NATO and other democratic alliances that preserved freedom throughout the second half of the 20th century. The speech itself became a model for democratic leadership during national emergencies, demonstrating how elected officials could appeal to citizen understanding and voluntary cooperation rather than relying on government coercion to achieve national objectives. Roosevelt's approach proved that democratic societies drew their strength from informed public support rather than blind obedience to authority. Perhaps most importantly, Roosevelt's Christmas Eve address established the principle that some conflicts cannot be resolved through negotiation because they involve fundamental disagreements about human nature and the proper organization of society. The lesson applied not only to Nazi Germany but to any totalitarian regime that sought to impose its will on free peoples who understood the value of democratic institutions. The strategic principles that Roosevelt demonstrated, trust your people with the truth, appeal to their highest values rather than their immediate self-interest, and never compromise core principles for temporary advantage, became essential elements of effective democratic leadership that remained relevant long after the specific circumstances of World War II had passed into history. So here's the question Roosevelt's decision poses: when facing overwhelming immediate pressure, how do you distinguish between tactical flexibility that serves long-term strategic goals and fundamental compromise that abandons the principles that make your cause worth fighting for? What would it take for you to choose certain short-term suffering over uncertain long-term survival when the people depending on your leadership are counting on you to find a way forward that preserves everything they value most? Franklin Roosevelt proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is not military force but moral clarity expressed through democratic leadership that trusts free people to choose sacrifice for principles rather than accommodation with evil when they understand what is truly at stake.